Hi everyone. In this video, I will be talking about the third and final aspect of what makes up the mindset of discovery. In the last video, I talked about curiosity and thoroughness, and the final aspect is openness, which, as I just said, is the topic of this video. In more detail, here is what we'll cover. First, we'll cover the biased evaluation of evidence, and we'll look at how to avoid that with decoupling. But then we'll also look at something called bias blind spot and the introspection illusion. And then we'll look at a way of trying to avoid those things by the activity of considering the opposite. And finally, second to last, we'll look at a certain conception of beliefs which is dangerous or hostile towards having the mindset of discovery, and we'll conclude with some specific strategies for avoiding that negative conception of beliefs. So again, in the last video, we talked about curiosity and thoroughness. Curiosity has to do with your overall goal in reasoning. Is your goal in reasoning to discover the way things are, or is it to, appear the smartest or dominate others, etc.? And it's important to have a good mindset for reasoning, that your goal be that of discovering the way things are. And thoroughness has to do with when we begin our reasoning and thoroughly searching for all the possible explanations for what we're reasoning about. And in this video, we'll look at openness, which has to do with evaluating and updating on the different possible beliefs or hypotheses which one discovers in the first stage of reasoning, which is search. So we begin with what's called the biased evaluation of evidence. So as we've seen, when we encounter evidence that supports our beliefs, we have a good feeling about it. We expect to find that kind of fact, and we take those facts to provide strong support. When we encounter facts that fit better with alternate views, we ignore them or consider them to be only weak support. And this is a vicious cycle. It feels like we keep on encountering strong evidence, and it makes us even more confident. This gives our initial reasons for belief too much evidence, and it creates what's called the evidence primacy effect, which was discussed in the previous lecture. Okay, so all of this has to do with how we evaluate evidence in a biased way, and this is something which we should avoid. And in order to avoid the biased evaluation of evidence, we need to decouple two things. These things that we need to decouple are first, our prior degree of confidence in something, and second, the strength of potential evidence for that claim. So here are two common mistakes. First, it's a common mistake to think that because something X is implausible, we infer that some evidence for X has to be weak. So because we have a prior degree of confidence in X, which is very low, we conclude that any evidence or some piece of evidence, this evidence that we find, has to be bad because X itself is implausible. Or conversely, we think because something X is plausible, because we have a high prior degree of confidence, we infer that some piece of evidence that we find for it has to be really good. However, these mistakes are failing to decouple our prior degree of confidence in a claim from the strength of any potential evidence for that claim. So we have to avoid these kinds of inferences from something being implausible to any evidence for it being weak. And we have to avoid inferring from something being plausible that any evidence we find for it has to be strong. So the point is that we should acknowledge when some piece of evidence strongly supports something, even if we have stronger evidence against it, or if we have a prior belief against it. And conversely, we should acknowledge when something is weak evidence for something, even if we have other strong evidence for it, or if we have a prior belief in it. So what does it feel like to have confirmation bias? Well, it's important to notice that generally it doesn't feel like anything at all. Generally, people believe that they are being objective and unbiased in their reasoning, when in fact, in many cases, they are not. Now, one might ask whether it helps to tell ourselves or be told to be as unbiased as possible. But in fact, even being told to be unbiased or telling ourselves just to be unbiased doesn't really help that much. And the reason it doesn't help is that we already think that we're being unbiased when in fact we're being biased. And that is the phenomena of bias blind spot. So even when we learn about cognitive biases, we don't think as we're reasoning that we're in the grips of them. We think, or we generally think, that bias should be transparent, that it would feel a certain way and we would notice it. But the processes that bias our evaluation of evidence are not introspectively accessible. And this is what's called the introspection illusion, which is the tendency to think that we can tell when our reasoning is biased through introspection. But if you recall from the readings in the lecture from from a couple days ago, the way that System 1 works is largely opaque and not transparent to us. So the kinds of biases and problems with our reasoning that are caused by System 1 processes are generally not accessible to our reflection. And so a vicious cycle emerges when we expect that cognitive biases are transparent, which again is the introspection illusion. So what happens is that we introspect to see whether we're being biased, and it feels like we're not. However, we in fact are. So what that does is make us even more biased, because in addition to being biased, we also think that we're not. So so as I just said, it actually doesn't really help people be more unbiased just to be told to try to be unbiased. But here is something which does actually help people become less biased. What helps is if we consider the opposite. What that means is that we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who believes something that's different than what we believe, and we think about how we would be evaluating the evidence that we're presented with if we are in fact in the shoes of someone who disagreed with us. So what you ask yourself is how would I have treated this piece of evidence if it had gone the other way? You also ask yourself, how would I have treated this evidence if I had the opposite belief? So for example, suppose you believe that the death penalty doesn't deter potential murderers. Okay, so suppose you're opposed morally to the death penalty, and one of the reasons you have for being opposed to it is that you don't think it actually effectively even stops people from being murderers. Now, suppose you get some evidence, and this evidence is that a study shows that total number of murders decreases in the 5-year span after states legalize the death penalty. So ask yourself, how would you have regarded this study if it said that there was no change in the murder rate? Would you have regarded this study more positively? Would you have had a more positive emotional reaction to the study? In an actual experiment done using this example of the death penalty and deterring potential murderers, and subjects were given this piece of evidence, it was found that imagining this study confirming the opposite made subjects stop applying selective standards. So what is important is that you evaluate the evidence while pretending to hold the opposite view. So a part of openness is being open to revision. It's being open to revising your beliefs. Now, I should say, with the example I just gave with the death penalty, there are, of course, many other reasons that one could be opposed to the death penalty, regardless of whether it deters murders or not. The point of that example is that even though one holds a prior belief, one should attempt to evaluate new evidence that's presented in an objective way. And the best way of doing that, and the best way of being open to new evidence and truly evaluating it, is to imagine that you, in fact, don't hold the belief that you do, and imagine how you would respond to that evidence if you did. Another important step is to try as much as possible to hold your beliefs lightly, in the sense that even if you are quite confident that they are true, you're open to evidence against them. And that is what it means to be open to revision. Sometimes, even when we should be very confident that a view is correct, we should still hold that belief very lightly, allowing even a simple piece of evidence to change our minds. So here is an example. Amy's bag has 99% blue marbles and 1% red. Bob's bag has 99% red marbles and 1% blue, and you have no idea which is which. Now suppose you randomly draw a marble from the first bag and you find that it's blue, okay? Because Amy's bag has 99% blue marbles, you should now be 99% sure that the bag you just drew from is Amy's bag. Okay, so from this first piece of evidence that the first marble that you drew is blue, you should be very, very confident, 99% confident that the bag you're holding, the one that you drew from, is Amy's bag. But now, suppose that you also randomly draw a marble from the other bag, and it turns out that it's also blue. What should you think now? How should you change your overall degrees of belief? The answer is that you should now think that there's only a 50-50 chance that you're holding Amy's bag. So from this new piece of evidence that from each bag you drew a blue marble, you should stop thinking that there's a 99% chance that the first bag is Amy's, and you should now go all the way down to a 50-50 chance that the first bag is Amy's. So this is an example of having a high degree of confidence in something, okay? So after you drew the first marble from the first bag, which was blue, you had a 99% confidence that that bag was Amy's. And that's a very high degree of confidence, but a very simple piece of evidence changed that rapidly, and you went all the way down to only 50% sure that the first bag was Amy. So again, this is an example of having a high degree of confidence, but allowing a simple piece of evidence to change that very rapidly. So often we should be confident in a belief, but still hold it lightly. Often we should be confident in a belief, but still hold it lightly. That is, allowing even one or two pieces of evidence to change our mind. So to counteract belief perseverance, evidence primacy, and confirmation bias, which are all problems with reasoning we've seen already, we must be consciously open to evidence that could change our mind and seek it out. And it's important to note that this takes great effort. It's not enough that we tell ourselves to be more fair or unbiased. We have to, one of the things we have to do, which takes great effort, is that we have to force ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of people who disagree with us, or put ourselves in the shoes of someone who thinks something else. And this is generally something which takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of practice, and in many ways it's a continual thing. So some questions that you could ask yourself to get yourself into the mindset of openness is you can ask yourself, could there be evidence that would change my mind? Or what would that evidence look like? And should I expect it to be obvious and easy to find, or might I have to go looking for it? So here is a quote from Hans Rosling from a book on critical reasoning. And I think it's a good quote which sums up what it means to have an open mindset, and in general, what it means to have a mindset of discovery. So he says, being humble means being happy to say I don't know. It also means when you do have an opinion, being prepared to change it when you discover new facts. It is quite relaxing being humble because it means you can stop feeling pressured to have a view about everything and stop feeling you must be ready to defend your views all the time. Okay, so when you begin adopting a mindset of discovery, it actually makes you feel overall more relaxed and positive than if you're constantly on the defensive. So, one of the final things I'll talk about is a certain conception of beliefs, and it's a way in which people actually tend to intuitively think of beliefs, and which leads to bad aspects of reasoning. And this is that often we conceptualize our beliefs as possessions. We think of them as things that we own or that define us. And when we think of our beliefs as possessions, it is especially hard to be open to revision because we generally don't like losing or getting rid of our possessions. So again, if we think of our beliefs as physical things that we own, we're going to be more defensive and less open to revising them or letting them go. Okay. And just as we often become attached to the physical things that we own, if we think of our beliefs as possessions, we'll also similarly be attached to them. And here are some signs of what it means to be attached to a certain belief. And the first is that we redirect attention. For instance, if someone presents to us, if someone presents us conflicting evidence, we try to avoid attending to it. We try to ignore it. Another thing is that we have resistance. So we just don't feel like thinking about it or talking about it. Okay. And finally, we feel the need, an emotional need to find fault with challenges, as opposed to assessing those challenges on their own merits in terms of how good the evidence is that the challenge presents. Okay, and to say that we think of our beliefs as possessions and are therefore attached to them isn't to say that we feel an intense attachment, like in this picture from The Hobbit, where this person has an intense desire to possess this ring. Actually, when we think of our beliefs as possessions that we're attached to, it's not obvious to us. It's not as obvious of an experience, okay? The feeling of being attached to our beliefs is actually quite subtle, and we don't actually usually notice it. In fact, it takes a highly developed self awareness and deliberately looking carefully for people to notice signs of being attached to their beliefs. So, this falls in step with the idea that developing a mindset of discovery and therefore becoming better reasoners is a very difficult and effortful task, which involves developing self awareness and self understanding. So, here are some ways in which we can counteract our attachment to our beliefs. First, we can avoid flinching from painful thoughts. So, it can be difficult sometimes to consider evidence which runs counter or against the things that we deeply believe. And it's important that we try to not let that stop us from assessing that evidence in a fair and open way. Second, we can view changing our minds as a sign of strength. So, as I mentioned earlier, if we have a defensive mindset, we might think that letting someone's evidence or letting what someone says change our minds, we might see that as us losing or being weak, but instead we should think of changing our mind as a virtue, and we should think of being open and assessing evidence fairly and letting that change what we think as a virtue or a sign of strength. Finally, we should acknowledge that we don't have to always fully believe something or fully disbelieve something. Rather, we can believe things to certain degrees. And when we realize that we can believe things to certain degrees, we can make more gentle revisions to our beliefs. So if we get evidence against something we believe, that doesn't mean we have to fully stop believing that thing. Rather, we can slightly decrease the amount of confidence we have in it. And the recognizing that we can adjust our degree of confidence in a gentle way, make it easier for us to change our mind in the light of new evidence. So again, it'll only be until Unit 3 that will really make sense of degrees of confidence. And starting next week and then in Unit 2, we'll be looking at a simpler model of reasoning, which is captured by deductive logic.